All right. Well, it is about that time. Let's get started. So this week, I got about 20 questions, about 20 questions from different people, and I'm going to do what I can to cover as many of those as possible. Now, uh, there are a lot of different questions about different areas, but I am looking for something that will for strategies that will cover as many of those areas as possible, and that's really what we're going to go from. So I looked at all these questions and I put them into categories. I think there are four that I won't have time for. We'll see how I do today, but I think we can cover most of them. So some of the questions that I got would be things like how to survive and stay young and beautiful in the first months at a new workplace. We've got how to deal with over talkative learners and quiet learners. How can I make book material more interesting? How to make all students work with maximum efficiency during the whole lesson, and how to not lose them over time. We got a question similar to that. So we're talking about different levels and engaging everybody, different levels of ability, mixed level classrooms, and engaging everybody at the same time. Then smart use of activities, including textbook activities. I'm dealing with mixed level lessons. And I hope to have time to go over the question about ing versus infinitive and how to teach that, and also how to teach phrasal verbs. We'll see on the timing here. And I have four here that I am ready to answer. And if we get to them, we'll get to them. So the biggest question here for me always is this: how can we get the best results possible, not only for students, but also for teachers? So for teachers, when we talk about results, what do I mean? I mean efficient planning. You are ready for the class as quickly, as efficiently as possible, number one. And in the lesson, you are able to make decisions that affect as many students as possible and improve as many students as possible, regardless of the situation. If you have 10 students, if you have 2 students, if you have 25 students, how can you as a teacher go in that classroom and make decisions and changes and improvements that help you be more effective with less effort? Because I've been in this situation before when I just had a group of students who wouldn't talk. They wouldn't talk, things weren't going the way I planned, and as a response, I just started to pour in more energy, like this will work. But that usually doesn't work. Pouring in that energy, getting involved in the sort of emotional reaction almost never works. Or it's very temporary and it is draining for the teacher. So being oriented on results for the teacher means effectiveness of planning. You need free time, you need a life, and effectiveness of work in the classroom as well, because every minute in the classroom is valuable. At the same time, we need to be effective for all students. And that's one of the most difficult points here from my perspective. It is students. So with students, there's so much diversity. Even if you're teaching in a group where everyone's from the same country, and maybe you're teaching in an industry where most people are similar genders. That happens. Like in the tech industry, you might be in a situation where you have all guys in the classroom. And when you have all guys in the classroom, does that help you? Does that help you work with them? And the answer is always maybe. Always maybe. If you have a very diverse classroom where everyone speaks different languages, it can be helpful because English is now the common language. But if I have a classroom of anybody, I have to expect they have different backgrounds, different interests, different goals, different levels of motivation, and clearly different levels of ability. How good are these students? How good are they at not just speaking, but understanding? How accurate are they? There are all these different ways in which they can differ from one another. So that's what makes the job interesting. We have to move all these students towards results, but we have to do so in a way that is effective for us as well as them. Because it doesn't always work to pour in your love and your energy and your effort. Because not everyone responds to that, number one. And pouring in all your energy, it can really be exhausting. It can be exhausting. And the question really is, how sustainable is it? So that's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for, a way to solve all of these problems. And I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few years, particularly as it relates to good lessons versus bad lessons. When I have a good lesson, when I have a lesson that is less than good, then what do I want? Well, I want consistency. So I want to look at lessons that are good, and I want to understand, well, how are they different? How are they different from those other lessons that didn't work out? When I see a teacher doing something great in a lesson, I want to be able to define and replicate that when I work with other teachers. So I have basically 3 things that will cover most of the topics asked about this week. And here's the way I want to talk about it. First, I'll write it in chat so you have that as well. We have goal-based planning. Goal-based planning. Now, when we talk about goal-based planning, I'm talking about you having a target and then planning based on reaching that target. Because you can have a piece of target language, but what do you teach? How do you teach it? If I'm teaching present perfect versus past simple at B1, B2 level, intermediate, then I could just go everywhere. And I could find 1,000 P1 fill in the blank activities. I could print out 6 or 7 different P2 activities and find 8 different speaking activities. And I have worked with teachers who do that. And in the end, they want to use all of it because they've prepared it, number one. And number two, not all of it is actually useful. We plan based on goals. You have a goal, and the question is, how do you get there? Then we have the second point, ability-based build and challenges. So build and challenge your students based on their ability. Build and challenge your students based on their ability. So build the difficulty of the lesson based on what your students are able to do. Based on their ability, what is your approach? And this is what's interesting. You have mixed levels of ability. We've already covered that. So the question becomes, how do I engage my best students and make it possible for my weakest students? So it needs to be engaging for my strongest and possible for my weakest. Because the biggest danger is, over time, I have stronger students and I have weaker students. Everyone improves over time, but the stronger students improve more quickly, and that gap between them grows. So we've got number one, we're gonna have planning based on goals. Number two, build up and challenge students based on their ability. And finally, the third point that covers most of the questions I got this week is going to be energy-based organization of the lesson. Energy-based organization. Now, by that, I mean looking at the materials that you have for your lesson and putting them in an order that engages your students better than they would otherwise. So the question is, I have these materials. I understand what my goal is. I understand how I can use these materials effectively based on my students' ability. Now, what's the order? Because if you just go straight through activities, they're going to be highs, they're going to be lows. But the biggest danger here is monotony. The biggest killer is just the same level of energy the entire time. So these 3 points, first, planning based on your goals. Second, building up and challenging your students based on their ability. And third, energy-based organization means that you'll have a better life, honestly. You'll get better results, and you'll be able to cover most of these points that we talked about. So first of all, how to survive and stay beautiful Stay young and beautiful, the question, in the first months at a new workplace. You know, from my perspective, a new workplace is just extra pressure on top of the beginning of the year. It's September. Things are wild right now. Things are crazy. Uh, Everything's happening at once. You're getting to learn. You're getting to know your new students. You might be talking with parents as well, working with other teachers. The teachers' room can be pretty crazy. So, how to survive and stay young and beautiful all the time? Because it can be stressful. And every year it's like starting anew with new people. So uh, your planning needs to be clear. Now, the question here is, what are the raw materials that you have as you plan your lesson? What sort of options do you have for working with your students? So let's just go through this really quickly. So I've got a presentation. So I'll label it here. Raw materials. These are the options for materials that you have in working with your students. So we'll have presentation. I'm doing this in chat, so you have a record of it. So we have presentation. What else? P1s, those basic low-level practice activities. P2s, those automate activities. Then we have P3s and productions. So speaking activities. What else? Well, from your textbooks, you'll also have things like reading. And we have some of those too from us. We have reading, listening. You also have access to a bunch of pronunciation activities, fluency activities. And that's it. I mean, that's not all, but that's pretty much all the categories that you're going to have going into the lesson. This is your tool belt. This is your tool belt. This is what you have going into the lesson. And the question is, how do I build my students up to where they need to be? And for that, you need to have a goal. You need to have a goal. And the goal isn't teach my students so they're better at English. The goal is I want my students to be able to blank at the end of the lesson. So, and based on that goal, you plan your lesson and you find materials. And then we'll talk about how to analyze the materials and use those materials most effectively. So first, let's say, just take an example. If you have any ideas, let me know. Any ideas for a goal in a lesson? Or any level, just give me a level and we'll work from there. So yeah, I'll throw one out there. So let's just do present continuous. So my goal is to get my students who have never seen present continuous before to use present continuous. By the end of the lesson. So let's say this is a beginner or elementary group, maybe false beginners. They have some English, they have some background, but present continuous is not a part of their way of speaking. So we're not going in immediately and differentiating with present simple versus present continuous. We're only doing present continuous. So what do I need to get there? That's the question. Presentation. I need a presentation. I need, after that, notes, probably. Notes for their reference. Then I'll have a P1 activity and maybe another P1 activity. P1 activity number 2, maybe. Depends. And I think probably in this case. Then we have P2, a P2 activity. Then potentially a P3 activity. And that's probably where I'm going to get to in the lesson. Going beyond that is likely unnecessary, and you don't need to push that far. The first lesson, you won't have time, and it won't be much more effective. So how can we think about this build? Well, check it out. If I have right here the build, this triangle that I draw all the time. So this is 0, and this is 100. 0, nothing. I know absolutely nothing about this topic, present continuous. 100. They're using present continuous easily in their speech with no reminder at all from you. Now, we have this build, and we label them P1, P2, P3, and production. This is the build, but you have to always remember here, this represents an increase in difficulty. For the students. And within this increase, you will find that it's gradual. There will be some P1 activities that are more difficult than others, some P2 activities that are more difficult than others, and that build doesn't only happen from activity to activity. It also happens from, not from P1 to P2, but it happens within P1 and within P2. So that's worth recognizing. And that's why I suggest having two P2s here, two P1s. So initially, my P1 will be very basic. My P1 will be very basic. They have the notes. And I have a specific way of doing notes with students. But after the notes, we go to P1. What's a good start for a basic P1? Fill in the blanks. I need one P1 that is fill in the blanks. Now, that's the most basic one because I'm just going to have now, right now, and that's it in every sentence. And then they have to fill in the blanks with the correct form. They already know to be. This is just something new, adding ing to the verb and recognizing now. So I want to make sure now is in every sentence there. Now, P1 fill in the blanks, and then my next step is to increase difficulty. I need to increase difficulty in the P1 stage. What can I do? P1, P1, make the sentences. Make the sentences, or make the questions. You could do something like that. Unscramble. Unscramble the sentences. Unscramble the questions. That is more difficult. That is more difficult than filling in the blanks. That is an increase in difficulty within P1. Because what I want to do is move my students closer to being able to do a P2 activity. So I've got fill in my presentation right here, brand new information at 0, then fill in the blanks, then make the sentences or unscramble, and then I'm ready for my P2 activity. Now I need a P2 activity. Now I would use one of these two P2 activities. There are several that you could use here. I would honestly just say, choose one. Choose one P2 activity to prepare for your lesson. But remember this, choose one, but always start slow. That's a huge deal. So if you're doing a card flip, tense build activity, if you're doing short answer race, if you're doing speed unscramble, or King of the Mountain, any of these different P2 activities, or a reaction game for that as well, any of these different P2 activities, and all of those I just mentioned would be fine for present continuous. All of those activities, you should always start slow. Never jump into speed, especially when something's new. So I've got P1, P1, P2, and then I'm gonna have a basic P3. Basic short conversations. So this is going to be a basic one. It's going to be little conversations, maybe of 2 or 3 minutes, based on a couple cards here and there, that sort of thing. You could even do a basic sort of meet and greet, something like that. You could play a game of liar, but something that keeps the conversation relatively small because of where your students are. This is a new topic for them. Now, I know where my students start and I know where they need to go. And based on that, I just chose 1, 2, 3, 4 different activities that I need. 4 different activities that I need. I have my presentation, I have my notes that they're going to fill in, and then I'm ready for the lesson. Not yet though, not yet, but that's goal-based planning. I have a goal, I think about where my students are and what steps they'll need to get there, considering this increase in difficulty, even within each different type of practice. If you just spend a lot of time printing off absolutely everything, you're gonna waste a lot of paper, sure, and waste a lot of your time. So beforehand, consider what your goal is and how you can, what activities will actually get you to that goal. So that's an example with present continuous. Now, one of the questions I got, how can I make book materials more interesting? Now, there are two questions here from me. Number one, how can you make them more interesting? And number two, and the first one I want to address, are they actually useful? That's the question. Now, most book activities are which level of practice? P1, P2, P3, or production. So book activities, are they usually P1, P2, P3, production? What do you think? P1. Most book activities that I come across are P1, particularly when they relate to a single topic. Usually you'll have a textbook. It'll have really poorly described grammar, or not necessarily incorrectly described, but very complicated in the explanation. Then you'll have a couple P1 activities. Then it'll go to a basic meet and greet, which is P3, which is often uninteresting for your students. Now, you can use those activities. And I actually say that if your students have books, you probably want to reference them every once in a while because they have the books. So it's not a bad thing to use, and I tend to use them for homework. If my students have books and they need to use the books because of the school policy, then I always give textbook or workbook exercises for homework. But it needs to be useful within your framework of build. If I have a fill in the blank from the textbook, I can use that and then use something else outside of the textbook for a more difficult P1 activity. So I look at the book and I look at whether or not it is useful for me to get my students to their goal. So that's first of all. Now, what about making them more interesting? Sometimes I wonder about some of the topics they choose in textbooks. It's very confusing to me why they chose certain topics, where the ideas come from, who thinks it's interesting. It is baffling sometimes, it's confusing. So if it is not interesting for my students, I either don't do it or I do it in a very specific sort of way. Now, for example, if I'm going to do a reading activity and I don't like the reading activity, but my students need reading practice, and the textbook is actually helpful for that. They won't enjoy the reading itself, but I can make it a challenge. I can give them a challenge like, hey, you have 5 minutes, find the questions as quickly as possible. Or I can make it a sort of memory game that forces them to actually remember as much as possible and scan within their reading of the text. So there are ways to make textbook activities more useful, but in this context of building up towards a goal, look at the textbook activity. Look at the textbook activity and consider whether or not it is helpful for you in reaching that goal. When is it unhelpful? Well, this is where I go back to this definition that I like to talk about with P1 activities, because most textbooks are P1 activities. This is where we establish understanding. When we establish understanding, this beginning after our presentation, we want to establish a couple things. Answer 2 questions. do my students understand the concept? Do they understand what I just taught them? And number two, do they understand that they understand? That's a big deal. Do they understand that they understand? Now, I need to see a P1 activity, a fill-in-the-blank activity after my presentation that my students do a great job on, or at least most of it. If they get less than 50% on a P1 activity after my presentation, what does that mean? They didn't understand the concept. I need to do a presentation again. Something's missing. Or they weren't with me when I gave the presentation, so I need to get their attention in a different way. Whatever it is, something is missing in their understanding of the concept. Now, if a textbook activity is too easy, and that does happen, where it's just too easy and it's just kind of silly to give that to your students, it doesn't help me answer that question. If it is too short, if there are 3 fill-in-the-blank activities, or questions, 3 fill-in-the-blank questions, and I don't think that's enough to confirm for myself that the students understand, then it's not very useful for me. So I'm probably going to look elsewhere for activities. Then, do they understand that they understand? This is a huge deal. And this is one of the biggest headaches. If you teach your students, let's say present continuous versus present simple, based on the description of the topic in the book, and the description in the book doesn't include stative verbs, but the activity does. So you do your presentation, present simple versus present continuous. They do the activity, but number 7 has a stative verb in it. And they all get it wrong. And you tell them they all got it wrong. And they say, what? What is this? I thought I understood. Now, apparently, I don't know anything. If the textbook activity undercuts your presentation, can't do it. Don't use it. Most textbooks activities are for establishing understanding. And they should establish understanding in a way that is useful to you in reaching your goals. And that means that they give you enough material to work with so that you understand that your students understand the concept, and it doesn't contradict what your students just learned, so that they understand and they feel confident that they understand so that you can move on. Now, that's how I judge any activity. Any activity I make, any activity in any textbook that I might come across, if it is a basic activity, it needs to confirm what I taught in the presentation so that I am confident that my students understand and they're confident that they understand. So that's some of what I think about textbooks in this case and how I judge anything I bring into the lesson. My P1 activities need to build the students up, not just in ability, but in confidence. So now we're to step 2, the build. We are to step 2, the build. And remember, if we're talking about step 2, building students up, step 2, building students up, we need a couple things here. Number 1, we need to make sure that it's possible. It needs to be possible for weak students. And number 2, it needs to be engaging for strong students. And what this does is actually take care of a lot of discipline problems. If you have students who think it's too easy, they're gone. They're gone. They're not going to be interested. And that's only if they think it's too easy. If it's actually not too easy, then what? It's actually not too easy. They're not paying attention. They're not improving. It needs to be engaging for students. But for the weak students, if it's too hard, if they just can't do it, they're lost. They're lost. And you can't necessarily teach to the middle. Because if you teach to the middle, you're not giving the strong students the best that they could get to improve themselves, to perfect themselves. And the weak students still can't do it because you're teaching to the middle. So that's really the goal here? The goal here is to be able to bring in everybody with this sort of build. And to understand how to do that, you need to understand how you can get the most value out of every activity. So look for value and, let's say, variations in every activity you do. Value and variations. And after you do that, consider the variations according to difficulty. And we'll take a look at specific examples of activities right here so that we can actually go through this process together. Let's take a look. So right here, I have a pronunciation activity. I have actually two pronunciation activities for two examples based on what I've heard from you all about what levels you tend to teach. I mean, there's a lot of younger people, like lower level students, but you know, there's a lot in the middle too. So I think I have right here, this one is, which level is this? I forgot. B1, B2. So that'd be like an intermediate one, and I have one here for beginner. So my idea with these beginner ones is twofold. Number one, I want my students to learn more vocabulary. This is vocabulary that the students can get based on pictures. So hand, sand, land, man, rubber, band. So they see the pictures, and that's extra practice for them for this new vocabulary. So what else? Well, obviously it's pronunciation. This is muscle memory. Now, how many different ways can I use this activity? Well, let's think about it. Number one, first, let's just do this. Pronunciation activities. Variation. So one, I just go through it slowly. Listen and repeat. So I'll say hand. My students say hand, sand, sand. I say hand, sand, hand, sand. Hand, sand, land, hand, sand, land. Man, rubber band, man, rubber band. Land, man, rubber band, land, man, rubber band. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. And they get this and, this sound, and they repeat it again and again in different order. I can have them point at it as they say it, and I just practice that way. First, slowly. My students repeat it after me slowly. That's an option. Then, what else can I do? What else can I do? I can do it individually. So I can say, okay, practice for 30 seconds. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. They practice for 30 seconds, then I call on an individual student. That is more difficult. What's another way I can do it? Well, how about this? For speed. So this would be like 3 times fast. 3 times fast. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. Hand, sand, land, man, rubber band. So I'm increasing the difficulty here so that they start slowly, then I start to force it so that their muscles start to react more quickly. They start to say these words more quickly. It becomes more reflexive for them. So those are 3 ways to use this activity right here. And I could do it also in teams. So team versions. So partners say it back and forth. Partner A says hand. Partner B, sand. Land, man, rubber band. Like, bike, hike. And they go through it that way. Then I can do speed. I can do that for speed. Which group is the fastest? And if they say it incorrectly, then the time doesn't count. That is another way of doing it. They can do the whole page. Which group can do it as a whole page? Which individual can do it as a whole page? And then they can practice for homework as well. That is at least 5 ways that I can use this pronunciation activity right there. And I am going to use these different ways throughout the lesson to keep my students engaged. Let's look at another activity. We have right here, pronunciation practice at an intermediate level. Can you show me where they went? Now with this, I want my students to work on what? What can I work on with this one? So let's say intermediate one. We have natural speech. That's what I'd work on at first. So can you show me? Can you show me? Can you show me where they went? Where they went. That's just natural speech and where they went. Where they went. And I'm going to tire them out with that basic listen, repeat. My focus is natural speech. And then I can also work on intonation. Can you show me where they went? Can you show me where they went? I can be angry. Can you show me where they went? And I can practice that with my students. It's a different way of working with that same sort of activity. And I just add another layer that uses the same activity and gives my students extra review while keeping it interesting for them. And that's the point. My weak students get more practice that they need, but my strong students are still engaged because of the variation. If I just went through this activity the same way every single time, my weak students will get better. My strong students will lose their mind out of boredom. So I need to look at the activity and see in what ways I can change it. So far, we've looked at pronunciation for, this is, what do I got here? Pronunciation exercise 1 for A0 to A1. Then I have pronunciation exercise 1 for B1 to B2. And this is just something extra. This will work with kids and teens, an easy way to vary it. So land, sand, man, hand, rubber band. So hand, land, sand, man, rubber band, whatever it was. Now say it like a frog. Hand, sand, man, fan, rubber band. Now say it like a ghost. Hand, sand, man. Say it like it's opera. And they can understand the meaning based on the pictures of how to say it, and they can have fun with it and get extra practice that my weakest students need, but that is still engaging for my strong students. Because even my strong students will need practice on this sort of thing. So that's just a little activity, a little kind of activity spice, I like to call these things, that you can use with your students to make repetition that is useful, mostly useful for the weak students, but also useful for the strong students, more engaging. It makes repetition more engaging, and that variation needs to increase in difficulty over time. Now, when I look at a P1 activity, you don't want to go from P1, that's the same level. You want your students to increase in difficulty along this stage right here. But if you move too quickly, it's too much for your weak students. So I have right here a P2 grab game with 4 and since, for present perfect with 4 and since. And I just took this stuff from the website. I looked up P2 and I'm just using examples from there. So how does this work? I cut it out, my students have a stack, and then they flip a card and they have to respond with 4 or since. So since yesterday, okay, I won, I get the card. For 3 hours, oh, you beat me, you get the card. And whoever has the most cards at the end wins the game. This sort of P2 activity is not at the beginning of P2. It's getting towards the middle or the end of P2 because that is a speedy reaction. That is reflexive reaction to the prompt. Okay. So what does that mean for what we're talking about in terms of engaging all students? Engaging the strong students and making it possible for the weak students. It means we need to build. And this is what I mentioned earlier. With P2s, you always have to start slow for a couple reasons. Number one, it won't be possible for the weak students. And number two, the strong students are probably arrogant. They're probably, like the students who have an idea that they're the best, they're probably not as good as they think they are. So we need to focus them on accuracy in the beginning. In the beginning, we need to prime them for accuracy, not just for response, like their reflexive response, because then we'll be automating something that is wrong. So I won't go straight to ready, set, go. Not yet. I'm going to build up the activity. Step 1. Let's just call this 4. So we'll do, I'm doing it in chat again. 4 since a P2 build. This is a build of four instance, and this is one activity, and I'm going to do it in this way. So first, in groups or pairs, students put the cards into two columns, for or since. Step one. Then students fill in notes. We check as a class. Check as a class. Fill in notes. Then students fill in notes. Here are the notes right here. For and since. Okay, so now at this point my students have the notes. And I could, if I think my students are ready, go to that grab game immediately right now. But I have another option. Student A says, so first they mix up the cards. Mix up the cards. Student A says a card. Student B says for or since with the reference of the chart. So with the reference of the chart, student A says yesterday. Student B looks, okay, since, and they respond. Then I can take away the reference of the chart. So same as number 4, but with no chart to use as reference. I'm increasing difficulty. I'm increasing difficulty so that now they're not referencing their notes, they're referencing their memory. And then I'm going to do a speed P2. I can do a fast P2 at this point. Grab game, anything like that. This is a very slow and deliberate build. Now, that is every single step. That is every single step. It might not be necessary. You should make that decision based on your weaker students. How much practice do they need? I mean, think about it. Step 4 and step 5. Those steps will take probably about 4 minutes. You're not going to totally lose your strongest students during that time, but it's a very important step-by-step build for your weakest students. And if you follow that build and this topic is new to your students, you will find that when you get to the P2 activity, the fast version, your weak students can beat your strong students. They can actually beat your strong students because of that build. It was made possible because you actually built up that way. So I will go through that build step by step if I need to, or skip a step if my class is able, and I can make a decision before the lesson or actually during the lesson if I'm surprised at their ability. And you're getting a lot more mileage out of one activity, meaning that your preparation time is much more effective, building your students up on this path towards fluency. Same thing here. So this is another one. I made this, I think, a couple weeks ago because based on a request. This is speed unscramble. Speed unscramble, you always want to start slow. First, they unscramble it. Then you check as a class. Then you fold the paper. I look at the scrambled versions and I read it. And you look at the unscrambled version and you check me. So Jane is my friend. She is not a teacher. I am a student. And the partner, yes, yes, yes. And then we switch. And we go through that process before we do the speed activity. This is a build that makes it possible for your weak students to grow. And it keeps your strong students engaged because there is a difference in the activity. It's not just repetition of the same thing. It's not just the same sort of activity over and over and over that's so boring. It's changing the activity that actually means that your students are actually going to do it. It's a big deal. So that's answering this question, a smart way of dealing with the mixed abilities in a class of 10. You look at the students who you have in the group, but first you understand the materials that you decided to use for the lesson. The question is, how can I build up ability using this material? So you're going to have different levels of P1s. You're going to build up to a P2 in a very deliberate way that allows everyone to follow you, but still engages those strong students. Strong students love P2s. They love P2s. They love the opportunity to compete. And what will happen is your students improve at the same rate, and all you're doing, actually improve at the same rate, and your strongest students perfect their ability. They perfect their ability. So and I had the burning question, how to manage a class and involve all students in the process, where they can have different levels of success, and some may be active and misbehave, overactive, too active and misbehave. Now, that question that I got has two parts. I've answered the first one, the one about working with mixed level classes. You have your goal, you understand what activities you can use to get to your goal, and then you break down each activity and decide which ones I need to use to build up my weak students and keep my strong students engaged. But that's engaged just in one activity. What about throughout the whole lesson? What about throughout the whole lesson? And this is where we get to step 3, energy levels. Energy levels. Now, your biggest enemy here, hands down, is monotony. Beware of monotony. I saw a lesson, P2s. You think they're very engaging and active and they're fast, and they are. But I saw a lesson where a teacher used P2s for 30 minutes without stopping. Nothing in between them, no follow-up, anything like that. That's a problem. Any sort of constant level of energy, if it's just a monotonous, constant level of energy, you will lose your students. You will lose your students because there's no change. Contrast is your friend. That's why if I'm, for example, transitioning to something different and I need to stand up, I might stand up kind of quickly and then pause for a second. I can do little things like that that draw more attention to me. Contrast can be in your demeanor. It has to be in how you act towards your students, your voice, your intonation. I saw a great lesson recently where the teacher didn't just say, close your books. She would just say, close your books. And she would say, oh, okay. And that was her voice was a little more excited and a little faster, and it got their attention more readily. They closed their books, and they were much more on the ball than another class where it was just close your books, where it was the same intonation the whole time from the teacher. There was no transition. Contrast is your friend when getting anyone's attention. If I'm giving a speech, you know what I'll do when I'm about to say something important? I'll pause. A pause is like underlining. It's like highlighting what you're about to say. Contrast works for people in getting their attention, so use it. Now, use it in all those little ways I just mentioned and in how you plan your lesson. So here's what I tell any teacher I work with. We have, look at your activities based on energy level. So label them. High, medium, and low. High, medium, and low energy levels. So, what do I mean by that? I don't mean the energy that the student should be using to think about what they're doing right now and the mental energy that they put into the activity. I'm talking about the electricity in the air, the excitement that they have taking part in an activity. I'm not talking about how much effort they put in, because that completely depends on the student and the interest of the student and the difficulty of the activity for each individual student. And now we're back to talking about diversity of students. I'm talking about the activities themselves. The activities themselves. So when I look at a lesson plan, it's like this. Let's say, check homework. So hello, let's label it ABC. Hello, hello everybody. Oh my gosh, I spelled hello. Take two. Hello, hello, and then check homework. Check homework, quiz, and then we'll have presentation, P1, P1, P2, slow, P2 slow, then G, P2 fast. Okay, look at that lesson plan. I can look at that lesson plan and tell you that your students will be bored. They will be bored. That's probably a good 45 minutes. That's a 45 minutes of lesson. That's 1 academic hour. And your students will be bored at the end. And when they're bored, they're not paying as much attention. And when they're not paying attention, they're not learning, because you have to concentrate on something to actually learn it. I think I said this last time, but if you just put me in a country where they speak a different language and I don't pay attention to anything they're saying and I'm just in my head all day, I don't learn the language just through osmosis. You have to pay attention to what's going on to actually learn something. So we need our students' attention, and this is a boring lesson for our students because of a lack of contrast. Now we're changing activities every few minutes. I've got hello, that'll take 1 minute. Check homework, that'll take, let's say, 5. Then quiz, we'll give them a quiz, that'll take 7 or 8 minutes. We're changing activities, but we're not changing energy level. Think about energy levels. Hello, that's kind of low energy. Like, hello, how's your weekend, blah, blah, blah. Low energy. Check homework, low energy. Quiz, low energy. Presentation, low energy. P1, low energy. P2 slow, medium. P2 fast, high energy. But by that point, they're already half dead. They're not really with you, and they're probably making more mistakes as a result, because there was so much monotony, so much low energy previously that will lose their attention. You have to win their attention throughout the lesson. How can we do that? Using the materials that we already talked about. And this is where things come together, and this is where I love it. Let's take one of those pronunciation activities. Those pronunciation activities that we talked about before, and all those different ways of using the pronunciation activity. I have one extra activity that I'm going to add to this lesson, and I'm going to use it in different ways that makes it, the lesson, more interesting for my students. So watch this. We'll have change lesson. So I have A, hello. Then B, pronunciation, slow. I'll do pronunciation, slow. Then I'll do, that's low energy. Then I'll do pronunciation, different, intonation, or character, depending on who you're working with. So that's a little higher energy and a slight increase in difficulty. Then D, check homework. Then E, I'll have a quiz. Then before I go into my presentation, I want to have something that's higher energy. So I'm going to say pronunciation, contest, 3 times fast. I could do that in individuals. As individuals, I could do it as pairs. And then my students are more energetic and they're more ready to pay attention when I do my presentation. And then I can go into, after my presentation, note the P1 I had up there. Then I'll do P2 slow, medium, and then J, P2 fast. That lesson plan will keep your students with you much more effectively. So I've got, hey guys, how's it going? Check this out. Land, sand, man, hand, rubber band. Okay, so let's slow it down. Land, sand, hand, man, rubber band. Man, rubber band. Man, rubber band. Land, hand, sand, man, rubber band. Okay, slowly. Okay, now I want to say it happy and show a picture of a happy person because it's low level. Land, sand, man, hand, rubber band. And you can explain to your students in their native language if you know it. It's important. Intonation is very important in English. You can't just say land, sand, man, hand, rubber band. Hello, how are you? And you can explain the value of that and to get them to practice it in a different way. Say it like you're very serious. Land, hand, sand, man, rubber band. Just like that. Then we'll go into checking homework. So that took an extra maybe 2-3 minutes. Then my students were checking homework and they're more with me than just, hey, welcome, homework check, let's do it. Then a quiz. That's reasonable after a homework check. That's reasonable after a homework check. So we have building up the energy, slowing it down, then bringing it back up after the quiz. Okay, guys, thanks. I'll check this. I'll bring it back to you next time. Ready. Land, hand, sand, man, rubber band. Land, hand, sand, man, rubber band. Land, hand, sand, man, rubber band. Okay, that's the challenge. 3 times fast. Can you do it? You have 1 minute to practice to yourself, and then we'll go over it. Ready, set, go. 1 minute. And check it. And they practice, then you test them, and then presentation time. So we have low energy, but then we have medium energy with different intonation. Then low energy with check homework and quiz. Then high energy with pronunciation contest. Then low energy presentation, low energy P1, medium, high. That variation, that contrast will keep your students with you and keep them more engaged. And when you have your activities ready for the lesson to achieve a certain goal, then you look at each activity and what you can do with each one in terms of building it up, in terms of mixing it up so that you bring them up step by step. You can look at those steps and understand what's low energy, what's high energy, what's more useful for my students, and understand how you can bring the energy back up in the lesson. One way to do that is pronunciation activities. Another way to do it might just be a silly story. I can tell a story about me looking like a fool in plenty of situations in Russia. And my students, oh yeah, that's a little refreshing little story. And then back into it, medium energy, then back to low energy to get my students with me. The contrast is your friend. So when we talk about, so I got a question about settlers and stirrers. That's how to do it. So settlers and stirrers are basically just high energy, low energy activities, but that's specifically for young learners. This is literally for anybody. I don't care who you're working with. If you look at your lesson plan and it's low energy right in a row or a lot of high energy right in a row, you know you need to mix it up. When I saw those students doing 30 minutes of P2 activities, they hated it. They weren't paying attention. They were making more errors. In order to win their attention and encourage their concentration, we have to give them contrast. Otherwise, it's all monotony. I don't care if the activity is different every single time. It's going to be uninteresting for your students. So I answered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 of the questions there. 8 or 9 of the questions right there. And I am pretty much out of time. But I think that, honestly, is the best advice that I can give to anyone right now in terms of lesson planning and efficiency. You will spend less time planning, and your lessons will be more effective if you go through that process. If you go through that process of thinking about it. Number 1, what are my goals? And choose activities based on that goal. Look at each activity and understand how you can break it down to make it a step-by-step build. And then put the activities in a way that doesn't have a monotonous level of energy throughout the lesson. Your students will be with you, meaning you have fewer problems with attention and discipline. And the weak students can actually do it. Your weak students can actually do it, and it works every single time. It works every single time. And I'm happy to actually go over, if you have questions about how to build up any specific activity that we've put out there in any way, happy to answer it, because that's the point of them. What I put out there, I want to be flexible, because this is results-based methodology. Wherever the idea comes from, it's my responsibility to implement it in the classroom. And just looking at the raw materials that we have, I want you to be able to take those materials. That's your tool belt, that's your arsenal. I want you to take those and use them as effectively as possible so that results for you. More efficient planning, more efficient lesson time. your students stay with you, and the gap between weak and strong doesn't grow. So that I owe you one for next time, at least one. I already have everything ready for it. No time today, but it's a great question I get often. Plus ing plus infinitive plus to plus v1. How do I teach that to students? How do I teach that to students? What's the rule behind it? What's the logic? I have an exact way to go over that I am happy to go over next time. Otherwise, have a great week. Have a great couple weeks. Keep sending the questions. That was a really good list of questions and really good questions, and it helps me understand how I can help you the best. So I appreciate you sending them in. That was a good chunk of them last time. And next time I'll go over the ones that I haven't gone over, and I'll answer as many new ones as I can. So thanks for watching. This is me saying goodbye on a Friday night. Take care.
Goodbye, thanks.